Millionaire calls. His wife, useless for not having kids. 4 years later, he finds her with twin sons. What happened will shock you. This story of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimate redemption will leave you speechless. Like, share, and comment where you're watching from. The crystal glasses clinked as Ellie and Lancaster poured another round of the expensive Bordeaux. The penthouse dining room sparkled with the city lights, stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything was perfect. The meal prepared by their private chef, the ambiance, the view. Everything except the heavy silence between them. Serafina, Sarah to those who loved her, watched her husband's movements carefully. Something was different tonight. His jaw was set too firmly, his eyes avoiding hers with unusual determination. 3 years of marriage had taught her to read his moods like weather patterns, and tonight, a storm was brewing. "You look beautiful tonight," Elian said suddenly, his voice lacking any genuine warmth. "Thank you," Sarah replied softly, smoothing the fabric of her designer dress. Another gift he'd given her, though she'd never asked for such extravagance. "Is everything all right? You've been quiet all evening." Elian finally looked directly at her, his steel-gray eyes calculating. At 38, he was 12 years her senior, and the heir to Lancaster Industries, a business empire that spanned continents. His father, Damien Lancaster, had made it clear from the beginning that family legacy was everything. "No, Sarah, everything is not all right." He placed his fork down with surgical precision. "I had a meeting with my father today. He asked again about grandchildren." Sarah's heart sank. The familiar pain washed over her, sharp at first, then dull and persistent. "I know it's been difficult, but the doctor said many things." Elian cut her off, waving his hand dismissively. 3 years of treatments, specialists, schedules, and medications. 3 years, Sarah." She swallowed hard. "I know it's been frustrating." "Frustrating?" His laugh was sharp, like broken glass. "It's been a complete waste of time and money, millions spent on treatments that don't work." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "Is that all you care about? The money?" "I care about results, Sarah. I always have. It's how I've built my life, how my family has maintained its position. We set goals, and we achieve them." He took a long sip of wine, studying her over the rim of his glass. "But you failed at the one thing you're supposed to do as my wife." The words hit her like a physical blow. "The one thing I'm supposed to do? Is that all I am to you? A baby-making machine?" "Don't be dramatic," Elian said coolly. "You knew what you were getting into when you married me. The Lancaster name comes with certain expectations. My father needs an heir. I need a son." Sarah's hands trembled as she placed her napkin on the table. "We've been trying. I've been through hell with these treatments, the hormones, the procedures, the disappointment month after month. And yet, here we are, still childless." Elian stood up suddenly, walking to the sideboard where he retrieved a manila envelope. "I've come to a decision, Sarah." Something in his tone made her blood run cold. "What decision?" He placed the envelope on the table between them. "I'm not wasting any more time. I'm 38 years old. I need to secure my legacy now, not later." With shaking fingers, Sarah opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. Legal documents, divorce papers. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she looked up at her husband of 3 years. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "I'm completely serious," Elian replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're useless to me as a wife if you can't provide me with children." The word useless echoed in her mind like a gunshot. Useless? Is that what I am to you after 3 years of marriage? What else would I call it? He shrugged, reaching for his wine glass again. "I've given you everything. This penthouse, designer's clothes, jewelry, vacations. I've spent millions on the best fertility treatments money can buy. And what have you given me in return? Nothing." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him, not now. "I gave you my love, my devotion, 3 years of my life." "Love doesn't secure a legacy, Sarah." His voice was cold, practical, businesslike. "I need a real woman who can give me an heir, someone younger perhaps, someone fertile." The cruelty of his words knocked the air from her lungs. "I can't believe you're doing this. Today of all days." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. What about today? Of course he'd forgotten. It's our anniversary, Elian. For a brief moment, something like shame passed over his features, but it was quickly replaced by his usual mask of indifference. All the more reason to make a clean break. My lawyers have drawn up everything. You'll be taken care of course. A modest settlement. I don't want your money, Sarah said, her dignity somehow intact despite the humiliation burning through her. Good, because you won't be getting much. His smile was sharp. The prenup is quite clear. In the event of your failure to provide an heir after 3 years, you receive only what you came in with. Sarah's mind raced. She'd come into the marriage with practically nothing. A small-town girl with dreams of becoming a writer, she'd met Elian at a publishing event where she'd been working as an assistant. He'd swept her off her feet, and in her naivety, she'd believed it was love. So that's it? 3 years together, and you're throwing me away like garbage. She stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Elian checked his watch, as if the conversation was taking too much of his valuable time. I have a dinner meeting tomorrow with my father. I'd prefer if you were gone by then. Take whatever personal items you brought with you. Personal items? Sarah's voice rose. This is my home. No, this is my penthouse, Elian corrected her. Purchased with my money, in my name. Your home was that little apartment in Brooklyn that you gave up when we got married. Perhaps you should have kept it. He smirked. Sarah fought to control her breathing. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her breakdown. With trembling hands, she gathered the divorce papers. You'll regret this, Elian, she said quietly. He laughed, the sound hollow in the vast dining room. I highly doubt that. I'll have what I want within a year, a proper wife, and soon after a son. You, on the other hand, will have nothing. Sarah took one last look around the penthouse that had never truly felt like home, despite her best efforts. The cold marble, the impersonal decor, chosen by Elian's interior designer, the absence of warmth or personality. It had been a showpiece, just like she had been. A trophy wife selected for her beauty and potential to bear children. You're wrong about one thing, she said, heading toward the bedroom to pack what little she could claim as truly hers. I won't have nothing. I'll have my freedom from you, and that's worth more than anything. Elian didn't respond, already engrossed in his phone, the woman he'd promised to love and cherish, already forgotten. An hour later, Sarah stood on the sidewalk outside their luxury high-rise, a single suitcase beside her, tears finally flowing freely down her face. She'd called a rideshare, unsure where to go or what to do next. Their joint bank account would surely be emptied by morning. Elian's efficiency in business extended to all aspects of his life, including destroying hers. As the car pulled up, Sarah took one last look up at the penthouse windows. Somewhere up there, Elian Lancaster was probably already making calls, moving on with his life as if she'd never existed. The realization hit her with brutal clarity. She had been nothing but a transaction to him. A business deal gone wrong. She slid into the back seat of the car, gave the driver the address of a modest hotel she could afford for a night or two, and let the tears fall silently as Manhattan's glittering skyline disappeared behind her. 3 days later, Sarah sat in a small cafe, staring blankly at the newspaper in front of her. The headline made her stomach churn. Lancaster heir announces amicable split from wife of 3 years. Amicable. She almost laughed at the audacity. There had been nothing amicable about being called useless, about being discarded like expired goods. But of course, Elian would control the narrative. He always did. The article went on to quote him directly. Serafina and I have mutually decided to part ways. We wish each other nothing but the best for the future. The coffee in front of her had gone cold, much like the hollow space in her chest where her heart used to be. She'd spent the past 72 hours in a daze, moving from the hotel to this cafe, unable to formulate a plan. Her phone had buzzed incessantly at first. Friends, acquaintances, even some of Elian's business associates' wives expressing shock and offering seemingly sympathetic ears that would undoubtedly report back to their husbands. She had ignored them all. Is this seat taken? Sarah looked up to see a woman about her age standing there, holding a latte. She had bright red hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. No, go ahead, Sarah replied, folding the newspaper to hide the headline. Too late, I saw it, the woman said, sliding into the chair. You're her, aren't you, Mrs. Lancaster? Or is it back to Miss Calloway now? Sarah stiffened. I don't want to talk about it. Fair enough. The woman extended her hand. I'm Lucia Reyes. I used to work for your husband until I told him exactly where he could shove his condescending attitude. Despite herself, Sarah's lips twitched into a small smile. You worked for Elian? 2 years as his executive assistant. Worst 2 years of my life. Lucia took a sip of her latte. That man has the emotional intelligence of a paperclip. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a laugh bubble up inside her. That's oddly accurate. I saw the way he treated you at company events, always introducing you as his beautiful wife, but never mentioning your intelligence, your kindness, or the fact that you have a master's degree in literature. Lucia's eyes were sharp, observant. Sarah was taken aback. How do you know about my degree? I make it my business to know things. It's what made me good at my job, despite working for Satan in an Armani suit. Lucia grinned. Also, I read your thesis online. The Feminine Reclamation of Power in Contemporary Fiction. Brilliant work. Warmth spread through Sarah's chest. Not happiness exactly, but something close to recognition. How long had it been since someone had acknowledged her mind, her accomplishments, rather than just her appearance or her failure to conceive? Thank you, she said softly. That feels like another lifetime ago. It doesn't have to. Lucia leaned forward. Look, I know this is forward of me, but I heard through the grapevine what happened. The real story, not that amicable split nonsense in the papers. Sarah's defenses rose immediately. And you thought you'd what? Get the inside scoop for the gossip mill? Lucia shook her head firmly. I thought I'd offer you a place to stay while you figure things out. What? I have a spare room in my apartment in Philadelphia. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and comfortable, and most importantly, it's far away from him. Lucia's expression was sincere. No strings attached. You can stay as long as you need to get back on your feet. Sarah studied the redhead's face, looking for signs of deception. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Let's just say I have a particular distaste for men who discard women when they've decided they're no longer useful. Lucia's voice took on an edge. Besides, I know how thorough Elian's lawyers are. I'm guessing you didn't walk away with much. The truth of those words stung. The modest settlement Elian had mentioned had turned out to be insultingly small, barely enough to cover a few months' rent in a decent apartment. The prenuptial agreement had been ironclad, designed specifically to protect him in this exact scenario. She had signed it without reading the fine print, drunk on love and promises. I can't impose on you like that, Sarah said, though the offer was tempting. The hotel was eating through her limited funds at an alarming rate. It's not an imposition if I'm offering. Lucia pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. I work remotely now for a publishing house in Philly. We're always looking for people with your background. Just something to think about. Sarah took the card, turning it over in her fingers. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, and that you'll stop reading garbage about yourself in the papers. Lucia stood up, gathering her things. Call me when you're ready, no pressure. As Lucia turned to leave, Sarah called after her. Why did you really come find me today? The redhead paused, considering her answer carefully. Because 3 years ago, I was in a similar situation. Different circumstances, same feeling of having the rug pulled out from under me. Someone helped me then. I'm just paying it forward. With that, she was gone, leaving Sarah alone with a cold coffee, a folded newspaper, and the first glimmer of possibility she'd felt since Elian had uttered that devastating word, useless. That night, in her hotel room, Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, really looking at herself for the first time in days. Her once vibrant brown eyes were dull with sadness, dark circles underneath them, speaking of sleepless nights. Her long chestnut hair hung limp around her shoulders. At 26, she should have been in the prime of her life, not feeling like she'd been used up and discarded. Was I really that worthless as a wife? She whispered to her reflection, Elian's cruel words echoing in her mind. She thought about the last 3 years, how she'd given up her budding career in publishing to become the perfect Lancaster wife, how she'd hosted dinner parties for Elian's colleagues, attended charity galas on his arm, managed their social calendar with meticulous care. how she'd subjected her body to painful, invasive fertility treatments month after month, enduring hormone injections that made her sick and emotional, all to fulfill her duty of providing an heir. All the while, Elian had continued his life largely unchanged. Business trips, late nights at the office, golf games with clients. The burden of their childlessness had fallen squarely on her shoulders, the failure assigned solely to her. The unfairness of it all hit her anew, and with it came a spark of anger. That spark was small but vital, the first emotion besides despair she'd felt in days. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the number on Lucia's card. Before she could second-guess herself, she typed a message. "This is Sarah. I'd like to take you up on your offer. I need a fresh start." The response came almost immediately. "Smart choice. The train to Philly leaves at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I'll meet you at the station." For the first time since that devastating dinner, Sarah felt the weight on her chest lighten just a fraction. She wouldn't let Elian Lancaster define her worth. Somehow, some way, she would rebuild her life. A life that had nothing to do with being a millionaire's wife or anyone's mother. A life that was entirely her own. As she packed her meager belongings, her phone buzzed with a notification, an email from her fertility clinic, requesting her to come in for a follow-up appointment to discuss her latest test results. Sarah hesitated. What was the point now? But something made her respond, scheduling the appointment for the following week. She would have to return to New York anyway to finalize some paperwork. One last visit to close that chapter of her life completely. Little did she know that appointment would change everything. The pristine white walls of the fertility clinic felt coldly familiar as Sarah sat in the waiting room 1 week later. She'd spent the past 7 days settling into Lucia's spare bedroom in Philadelphia, grateful for the distance from New York and all its painful memories. But now she was back, her stomach in knots as she waited for Dr. Mitchell to call her name. "Mrs. Lancaster?" A nurse appeared in the doorway. "It's Ms. Calloway now," Sarah corrected quietly, standing up and smoothing her simple skirt. Gone were the designer clothes and accessories that had marked her as Elian Lancaster's wife. She'd left most of them behind in the penthouse, unwilling to carry those reminders into her new life. The nurse nodded sympathetically and led her down the hallway to Dr. Mitchell's office. The fertility specialist rose from behind her desk when Sarah entered, her expression unreadable. "Serafina, thank you for coming in. Please, have a seat." Dr. Mitchell gestured to the chair across from her. "I heard about your situation. I'm very sorry." Sarah nodded stiffly. "News travels fast in certain circles." "Indeed." The doctor opened a file on her desk. "I called you in because we received the results from your last round of tests. And there's something important you should know." A lump formed in Sarah's throat. More bad news was the last thing she needed. "What is it? Another issue with my fertility?" Dr. Mitchell looked directly at her. "Actually, no. According to these results, there's nothing wrong with your fertility at all. You're perfectly capable of conceiving and carrying a child." Sarah blinked, confused. "But that can't be right. We've been trying for 3 years. All the failed treatments—" "I know," Dr. Mitchell interrupted gently. "That's why we finally suggested testing both partners. Your results show no issues whatsoever. But these," she tapped another file, "are your husband's results." "Elian got tested?" Sarah asked, surprised. He'd always refused, insisting the problem must be with her. "Yes, just before your last appointment. He didn't tell you?" Sarah shook her head, a sinking feeling in her stomach. Dr. Mitchell sighed. "Ms. Calloway, the test results are conclusive. Your ex-husband has severe oligospermia, a very low sperm count, combined with poor motility. In layman's terms, he's functionally infertile. The chance of him fathering a child naturally is extremely low." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as Sarah processed these words. "Are you saying the reason we couldn't conceive was Elian, not me?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, doctor," Mitchell confirmed, her voice gentle but firm. "And based on the nature of his condition, it's likely been this way since birth. No amount of treatments for you would have solved the problem." A laugh bubbled up from Sarah's throat, sharp and humorless. "He left me because I couldn't give him children. He called me useless." "I'm so sorry, Serafina. I know this must be difficult to hear." Difficult didn't begin to cover it. 3 years of her life spent believing she was broken. 3 years of painful procedures, hormone injections, temperature tracking, scheduled sex, and monthly disappointment. 3 years of Elian's growing resentment and her own deepening sense of failure, all because he refused to consider that he might be the source of the problem. Did he know? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Did he see these results before he left me? Dr. Mitchell's hesitation was answer enough. I can't discuss another patient's appointment details, but the timing of your divorce and these test results, I felt you deserved to know the truth about your own fertility. The rage that consumed Sarah in that moment was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Pure, white-hot, and all-encompassing. Elian had known. He'd received his test results, and instead of facing the truth, he'd discarded her, called her useless, humiliated her publicly, all to protect his precious ego and family legacy. Thank you for telling me, Sarah managed to say, her hands shaking with anger and shock. There's something else, Doctor, Mitchell added, closing the files. Given that you're still young and perfectly fertile, you have many options if you ever decide to pursue motherhood on your own terms. Donor sperm, for instance, is a straightforward procedure with high success rates for someone with your health profile. The idea struck Sarah with unexpected force, motherhood on her own terms, without Elian, without the pressure of carrying on the Lancaster legacy. I'll think about it, she said, rising from her chair on unsteady legs. Dr. Mitchell handed her a folder. Here's a copy of your results and some information on your options, should you ever want to explore them. Sarah clutched the folder to her chest like a shield as she walked out of the clinic into the bright sunlight. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lucia. How did it go? Want me to meet you for lunch before your train back? She typed back a quick response. Meet me at Cafe Luna in 20. You won't believe what I just found out. 30 minutes later, Sarah watched Lucia's eyes widen as she explained what Dr. Mitchell had told her. That absolute bastard, Lucia exclaimed, slamming her coffee cup down with such force that nearby patrons turned to stare. He knew he was the problem and still blamed you, then divorced you for it. Apparently, Sarah said, still processing the revelation herself. The great Elian Lancaster couldn't bear the thought of being less than perfect. Better to discard his wife than admit he's the one who can't produce an heir. Lucia shook her head in disgust. What are you going to do? It was the question Sarah had been asking herself since leaving the clinic. The truth had shattered something inside her. The last remnants of the woman who had loved Elian Lancaster, who had blamed herself for failing him. In its place was a growing sense of righteous anger and, surprisingly, relief. First, I'm going to stop feeling worthless, Sarah said with newfound determination. Then I'm going to build a life that has nothing to do with him or his precious legacy. That's my girl, Lucia grinned, raising her coffee cup in a toast. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, Sarah echoed, feeling the first genuine smile in weeks spread across her face. 4 months passed in a blur of change and growth. True to her word, Lucia had helped Sarah secure a position at the publishing house where she worked. Starting as an assistant editor, Sarah quickly proved her worth, drawing on her academic background in literature and her natural eye for compelling storytelling. She'd found a small apartment of her own in a charming neighborhood of Philadelphia, far from the luxury she'd grown accustomed to in New York, but infinitely more satisfying. For the first time in years, she was surrounded by things she had chosen, space she had created, a life she was building on her own terms. The divorce had been finalized with brutal efficiency. Elian's lawyers had made sure she walked away with nothing but her personal belongings and the insulting settlement that barely covered 2 months' rent. But Sarah had discovered something unexpected in poverty. Freedom. Freedom from expectations, from appearances, from the constant pressure to be the perfect Lancaster wife. I'm thinking of starting a support group, Sarah told Lucia one evening as they shared takeout in her new apartment. For women going through difficult divorces or dealing with infertility. So many women blame themselves when they can't conceive, just like I did. That's a brilliant idea, Lucia said, reaching for another spring roll. You could use the community center near your apartment. They're always looking for meaningful programs. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I want to help other women avoid the pain I went through, the self-doubt, the shame. Speaking of avoiding pain, Lucia said carefully, Have you thought any more about what Dr. Mitchell said? About your options for having a child on your own? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah had indeed thought about it, more than she cared to admit. The folder from the fertility clinic sat in her bedside drawer, consulted late at night when sleep proved elusive. I have, she admitted, but it's a huge decision. The timing, the finances, the reality of being a single parent. You wouldn't be alone, Lucia reminded her. You'd have me and all the friends you've made here. Sarah smiled gratefully. Philadelphia had proven to be fertile ground for new relationships. Her colleagues at the publishing house had welcomed her warmly, and she'd connected with several women in her apartment building who quickly became friends. I know, and I'm grateful for that. Sarah sighed, twirling noodles around her fork. I just need to be sure it's what I want for the right reasons, not to prove something to Elian or to validate myself. Lucia nodded understandingly. That makes sense. Take all the time you need. There's no rush. But even as she said it, both women knew that time was a luxury in matters of fertility. At 26, Sarah was still young, but the biological clock was a reality she couldn't ignore forever. The next day, Sarah found herself at the first meeting of her support group, Healing Hearts, at the community center. Only 3 women had shown up, but their stories of loss, shame, and rebuilding resonated deeply with her own experience. As she was packing up after the meeting, a tall man with kind eyes approached her. That was really powerful what you shared today, he said, extending his hand. I'm Dr. Cassian Wolfe. Sarah Calloway, she replied, shaking his hand. Are you with the community center? He shook his head. I'm a fertility specialist at Philadelphia Women's Clinic. I sometimes refer patients here for emotional support. Mind if I take some of your flyers to share at my practice? Of course, Sarah said, handing him a stack. If you don't mind me asking, what made you attend today? Dr. Wolfe's smile was warm. I believe medical treatment is only one part of the fertility journey. The emotional and psychological aspects are just as important and often neglected in clinical settings. There was something refreshingly compassionate about his approach. It stood in stark contrast to the cold, clinical experience Sarah had endured in New York, where she'd felt more like a failing incubator than a woman dealing with profound loss. That's unusual, she said. Most doctors I've encountered focus solely on the medical side. That's unfortunately true, he agreed, but I've found that addressing the whole person leads to better outcomes, regardless of whether a patient ultimately conceives. They continued talking as they walked out of the community center, discovering a shared passion for helping women reclaim their sense of worth beyond their reproductive capacity. I actually run a program for women exploring alternative paths to motherhood, Dr. Wolfe mentioned as they reached the parking lot. Single women by choice, same-sex couples, women with fertility challenges, we cover everything from IVF to adoption to surrogacy. Sarah felt a flutter of interest. That sounds wonderful. We're having an information session next Thursday evening, if you'd like to come. No pressure or commitment, just information. He handed her a business card. Some of the women from your group might benefit as well. I'll think about it, Sarah promised, tucking the card into her purse. That night, she lay awake, thinking about Dr. Wolfe's invitation and the possibilities it represented. The idea of motherhood, divorced from Elian, from the Lancaster legacy, from all the pain of the past 3 years, beckoned to her with unexpected allure. Was she ready? Could she really do this on her own? The question swirled in her mind as she drifted off to sleep. The following Thursday found Sarah sitting in a comfortable conference room at Philadelphia Women's Clinic, surrounded by women of various ages and backgrounds. Dr. Wolfe presented information with clarity and compassion, addressing not only the medical aspects of alternative paths to motherhood, but also the emotional, financial, and practical considerations. For many women, the journey to motherhood doesn't follow the traditional path, he said, his gaze briefly meeting Sarah's. But that doesn't make it any less valid or the families that result any less whole. As the presentation concluded and attendees broke into small discussion groups, Sarah found herself drawn to the section on single motherhood through sperm donation. The statistics were encouraging: high success rates for women under 30, straightforward procedures, and well-established legal protections. You have questions, Doctor, Wolfe observed, approaching her as she studied a pamphlet. Many, Sarah admitted. primarily about timing. How does one know when they're ready for such a life-changing decision? He considered her question thoughtfully. In my experience, there's never a perfect moment, but there is a point when the desire for a child outweighs the fears and uncertainties that come with parenthood. And what about doing it alone? Without a partner? Single mothers by choice are some of the most prepared, dedicated parents I've ever encountered, he said sincerely. They've considered every angle, made thoughtful plans, and chosen motherhood with complete intentionality. His words resonated with something deep inside Sarah, a longing she'd suppressed during the painful final months with Elian, when motherhood had become a source of shame rather than joy. Would you... She hesitated, then pressed on. Would you have time for a consultation to discuss my specific situation? Dr. Wolf's smile was warm, without a trace of judgment. Of course. How about next week? I can review your medical history and we can talk through your options in detail. As she left the clinic that evening, Sarah felt a lightness in her step that had been absent for too long. For the first time since Elian had uttered that devastating word, useless, she felt a sense of purpose, of possibility, of reclaiming her power to choose the shape of her own life. Maybe, just maybe, motherhood could still be part of her future, on her own terms, free from the shadow of Lancaster expectations. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Back in her apartment, Sarah pulled out the folder. Doctor, Mitchell had given her months ago. She spread the documents across her kitchen table, reading them with new eyes, not as reminders of failure, but as keys to a future she was only beginning to imagine. She picked up her phone and texted Lucia. I think I'm going to do it. I'm going to explore having a baby on my own. Lucia's response was immediate. Yes! You're going to be an amazing mother, and Auntie Lucia is ready for spoiling duties. Sarah laughed, tears of joy and nervousness mingling as she typed back, Don't get ahead of yourself. I'm just exploring options for now. But in her heart, a decision was taking shape, clear and strong and undeniable. She wouldn't let Elian's cruelty define her worth. She wouldn't let his rejection determine her path. She would reclaim the dream of motherhood on her own terms, with her own strength, creating a family bound by love rather than obligation. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Sarah placed a protective hand over her flat stomach, imagining the possibility of new life growing there someday soon. Life that had nothing to do with the Lancaster legacy and everything to do with her own choice to love and nurture a child. The woman Elian Lancaster had discarded as useless was about to prove just how powerful she truly was. The months that followed passed in a blur of research, consultations, and soul-searching. Sarah approached the prospect of single motherhood with the same thoroughness and determination that had earned her rapid promotions at the publishing house. By day, she edited manuscripts and mentored new writers. By night, she pored over information about donor profiles, success rates, and parenting as a single mother. Dr. Cassian Wolf had become not just her fertility specialist, but a trusted advisor and, increasingly, a friend. His patient guidance helped her navigate the complex medical, ethical, and emotional terrain of assisted reproduction. The donor selection is the part most women find most challenging, he explained during one of their consultations, spreading profiles across his desk. Take your time with this decision. There's no rush. But Sarah felt a sense of urgency she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the lingering echo of those wasted years with Elian, or perhaps it was simply her biological clock making itself known. Whatever the cause, 6 months after leaving New York, she had made her choice. A donor with kind eyes, an impressive academic background, and a thoughtful letter explaining his decision to help women become mothers. I'm ready, she told Dr. Wolf during their final consultation before beginning the IVF process. I've done all the research, set up my support network, and arranged for flexible work hours. I want to do this. He studied her face, searching for any signs of doubt. Finding none, he nodded. Then let's begin. The procedure itself was surprisingly anticlimactic, clinical and brief, nothing like the romantic conception she had once imagined. But as she lay on the examination table, Sarah felt a profound sense of reclamation. This was her choice, her body, her future child, if the procedure was successful. Now we wait, doctor, Wolf said with an encouraging smile. 2 weeks, and we'll know. Those 2 weeks were the longest of Sarah's life. She threw herself into work, into her support group, into preparing her apartment for a child who might never come. Lucia hovered anxiously, offering distraction, comfort, and the occasional indulgent ice cream binge when the waiting became unbearable. The morning of her follow-up appointment, Sarah woke before dawn, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. She had resisted the temptation to take a home pregnancy test, wanting to hear the news, whatever it might be, from Dr. Wolf himself. "Your HCG levels are elevated," he told her, his professional demeanor giving way to a warm smile. "Congratulations, Sarah. You're pregnant." The words washed over her like a wave, leaving her breathless and dizzy with joy. "I'm pregnant? It worked? The first time?" Dr. Wolf nodded. "It did. And based on these numbers, it's a strong start. Of course, we're very early in the process, and there are never guarantees, but I'm pregnant," Sarah finished, tears welling in her eyes. "After all this time, after everything, I'm going to be a mother." The full impact of the news didn't hit her until later that evening, as she stood alone on the small balcony of her apartment, watching the sunset paint the Philadelphia skyline in shades of gold and pink. A child was growing inside her, a miracle of science and determination, a new life that had nothing to do with the Lancaster legacy. Placing a protective hand over her still flat stomach, Sarah made a solemn promise. "You will never feel unwanted, not for a single day of your life. You are already so loved, so wanted, so precious to me." The tears that fell as she spoke were healing tears, washing away the last remnants of shame and inadequacy that Elian had planted in her heart. The first trimester passed with the usual anxieties and discomforts, morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, and the constant fear that something would go wrong. But at 12 weeks, an unexpected surprise left Sarah stunned in the best possible way. "There are 2 heartbeats," Dr. Wolf announced during her ultrasound, turning the screen so she could see the tiny fluttering shapes. "You're carrying twins." "Twins?" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "How is that possible? We only transferred 1 embryo." "The embryo split," he explained. "It happens sometimes. Identical twins. Both boys, from what I can see. 2 sons." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Elian had discarded her for failing to give him a son, and now she would have 2 of her own. But unlike Elian, she would have welcomed daughters just as joyfully. "2 babies," she whispered, watching the miraculous images on the screen. "Twice the love." Her pregnancy progressed smoothly after that initial shock. Her body, which she had once viewed as broken during those years of failed fertility treatments, proved perfectly capable of nurturing twin boys. Her career continued to flourish, her colleagues and superiors supportive of her impending motherhood. And Dr. Wolf remained a steady presence, his care extending beyond the medical requirements of her pregnancy. He accompanied her to a childbirth class when Lucia was out of town, helped assemble a crib on a rainy Saturday afternoon, and always found time for her questions, no matter how trivial they might seem. "You're going above and beyond for a patient," Sarah observed one evening as he fixed a wobbly shelf in the nursery she was preparing. He paused, hammer in hand. "Is that how you see yourself, as just a patient?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Sarah felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the twins' movements. "I don't know how to see myself these days," she admitted honestly. "Everything is changing so fast." He nodded understandingly. "No pressure, no expectations. Just know that I'm here, whatever you need." The simple sincerity of his words touched her deeply. After Elian's conditional love and harsh judgment, Cassian's quiet support was like cool water in a desert. As her due date approached, Sarah took leave from the publishing house, her apartment now fully prepared for the twins' arrival. The nursery was painted a soft green, 2 cribs positioned side by side, a rocking chair waiting in the corner. It was nothing like the luxury her sons would have known as Lancaster heirs, but it was warm and safe and filled with love. One balmy evening in her 8th month, Sarah visited a quiet beach just outside the city, her swollen belly making it difficult to walk on the sand. But she persisted, finding a secluded spot to watch the sunset over the water, The beauty of the moment moved her to tears. Tears of gratitude, of anticipation, of fierce love for the two boys she would soon meet. "I promise you'll never feel unwanted," she whispered to her unborn sons, echoing the vow she'd made months earlier. "You will be loved for exactly who you are, not for what you can do or what legacy you might carry. You are already enough, already perfect, already everything I could ever want." The twins arrived 2 weeks early, entering the world within minutes of each other, after a labor that tested every ounce of Sarah's strength and determination. As she held them for the first time, tiny, perfect bundles with dark hair and solemn eyes, she felt a love so overwhelming it nearly crushed her chest. "Have you chosen names?" the nurse asked, as she helped position the first twin for feeding. Sarah nodded, gazing down at her sons. "Ethan and Noah, it means strong and peace. Everything I hope for them." Lucia, who had been by her side throughout the grueling 18-hour labor, wiped tears from her eyes. "They're perfect, Sarah. Absolutely perfect." And they were, healthy, thriving, and blissfully unaware of the journey that had brought them into existence. They would never know the pain of being deemed useless or the struggle to prove their worth. They would grow up knowing only that they were wanted, cherished, and enough. 4 years later, Elian Lancaster stood at the window of his corner office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline without really seeing it. The city stretched before him, gleaming and prosperous, a reflection of his own success, or what appeared to be success to those who didn't know better. The reality was far less impressive than the facade. 4 years after discarding Serafina, his life had taken turns he hadn't anticipated, each one more disappointing than the last. "Mr. Lancaster?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your father is here to see you." Elian suppressed a groan. Meetings with Damian Lancaster had become increasingly unpleasant over the past year. "Send him in." The door opened to reveal Damian, 70 years old but still imposing, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom suit impeccable. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built an empire and expected absolute deference from those around him, especially his son. "Elian." The greeting was curt, without warmth. "Father, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Damian's cold eyes swept over the office, taking in the awards, the expensive furnishings, the trappings of success that couldn't quite mask the underlying problems. "I've just come from a meeting with the board," he said without preamble. "They share my concerns about the direction of the company under your leadership." Elian tensed. The quarterly reports were not as bad as they seemed. The new publishing division just needs time to— "Excuses," Damian cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Always excuses. The publishing division was your pet project, against my better judgment. Now we're losing ground to competitors who know what they're doing." The irony wasn't lost on Elian. One of those competitors was Sarah's company, though he would never admit that to his father. "I can turn it around," Elian insisted. "I just need— time?" Damian's laugh was cold. "You've had time. 4 years since you assured me that ridding yourself of that wife of yours would allow you to focus on securing both the business and the family line. And what do I have to show for it? A struggling company and still no grandson." The familiar shame burned in Elian's chest. His second marriage to Vivienne, a calculated choice based on her family connections and apparent fertility, had proven just as childless as his first. But unlike Sarah, Vivienne had quickly grown tired of being valued only for her potential to bear children. "Vivienne and I are still trying," he said stiffly. Damian's eyebrow rose. "Are you? Because according to her divorce attorney, she's moving out next week." The news hit Elian like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? Vivienne hasn't said anything about divorce." "Perhaps she's tired of being treated like a broodmare rather than a wife," Damian suggested, his voice laced with contempt. "You never did learn how to keep a woman, did you?" The criticism stung all the more because it contained a kernel of truth. Elian had chosen Vivienne for her youth, her fertility, her social connections, never for love or compatibility. Their marriage had been a business arrangement from the start, one that she had apparently decided was no longer beneficial. "I'll speak with her," Elian said, struggling to maintain his composure. "We can work through this." "I doubt it." Damian moved to the window, looking out over the city with a proprietorial air. Her attorney was quite clear. "She's done, and frankly, so am I." "What does that mean?" Damien turned to face his son, his expression implacable. "It means I'm tired of waiting for you to secure this family's future. The board agrees with me. It's time for new leadership at Lancaster Industries." "You can't be serious," Elian said, his voice rising. "You're talking about removing me as CEO, your own son?" "I'm talking about protecting what I've built," Damien corrected him. "I gave you everything. The best education, opportunities most men would kill for, endless second chances. And what have you done with it? Failed marriage after failed marriage, business ventures that hemorrhage money, and still no heir to carry on the Lancaster name." The unfairness of the accusation burned in Elian's throat. He had never told his father about his infertility diagnosis. The shame was too great. The disappointment would be too crushing. Better to let Damien believe the problem lay with his wives than with his son. "I've dedicated my life to this company," Elian argued, desperation creeping into his voice. "I've sacrificed everything for the Lancaster legacy." "Not enough, apparently," Damien replied coldly. "You have 6 months to turn things around, both in business and in your personal life. Find a way to secure an heir, or I'll have no choice but to look elsewhere for the future of this family." "What does that mean?" Elian demanded. "I'm your only child." Damien's smile was thin and without humor. "There are cousins, distant relations who might prove more capable of carrying on the Lancaster name. Adoption is also an option, though not my preference." The threat was clear. Produce an heir or be replaced, not just as CEO, but as the inheritor of the Lancaster fortune and legacy. Everything Elian had built his identity around was at risk. 6 months, Damien repeated, moving toward the door. "Prove to me that you are worthy of the Lancaster name, or prepare to lose everything." The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in Elian's ears like a death knell. Alone in his vast office, surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly felt hollow, he confronted the reality of his situation. His second wife was leaving him. His father was threatening to disown him. His company was losing ground to competitors. And the root cause of it all, his infertility, his inability to produce the heir that the Lancaster legacy demanded, remained his shameful secret. As the weight of these truths settled on his shoulders, Elian's thoughts turned, as they often did in moments of desperation, to Serafina. He had treated her cruelly, discarded her when she no longer served his purpose. But she had been a good wife in all other ways. Supportive, intelligent, socially adept. Perhaps if he could find her, he could convince her to return. With his resources, they could pursue surrogacy or adoption. Anything to secure the heir his father demanded. It was a desperate plan, born of panic rather than genuine remorse. But as Elian reached for his phone to call his private investigator, he had no idea just how drastically the tables had turned, or that the woman he had once called useless was now flourishing in ways he could never have imagined. "Mommy, look at my drawing." 4-year-old Ethan held up a colorful scribble that vaguely resembled a dinosaur. His dark curls bounced as he jumped up and down with excitement. "That's amazing, sweetheart," Sarah replied, bending down to his level despite the designer dress she wore. "Is that a T-Rex?" "No, silly. It's a velociraptor," he giggled, throwing his arms around her neck. "My mistake," Sarah laughed, breathing in the sweet scent of his shampoo. "Where's your brother?" "Noah's with Uncle Cassian. They're fixing my robot." Ethan pointed toward the living room of their spacious beach house. Sarah smiled at the term Uncle Cassian. Though she and Cassian had been dating for nearly 3 years, they had kept their relationship deliberately slow and steady for the twins' sake. He had become a constant, loving presence in their lives, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, content to build their relationship one day at a time. "Well, tell them to hurry up. We need to leave for the charity gala in 30 minutes, she called, as Ethan raced back to join his brother. The annual Children's Hospital benefit was the biggest event in Philadelphia's social calendar, bringing together the city's elite for an evening of champagne, dancing, and conspicuous philanthropy. As the newly appointed editorial director of Phoenix Publishing, Sarah's attendance was expected. The company had donated significantly to the hospital's new pediatric research wing, a cause particularly close to Sarah's heart, given her own journey to motherhood. "You look stunning," Cassian said, appearing in the doorway of her bedroom. At 40, he was handsome in a distinguished way, with gentle eyes and a warm smile that had been her anchor through the challenges of single motherhood. "Thank you," she replied, fastening a pair of simple diamond earrings, one of the few luxuries she'd allowed herself as her career flourished. "Are the boys excited about their sleepover with Lucia?" Excited is an understatement. They've been planning their fort-building strategy all afternoon. Cassian moved behind her, placing a gentle kiss on her bare shoulder. "Are you nervous about tonight?" Sarah considered the question as she applied a final touch of lipstick. "Not nervous exactly. These events just remind me of my old life sometimes." Cassian nodded understandingly. Though she rarely spoke of Elian anymore, he knew enough about her past to recognize the lingering shadows. "Well, if it helps, you're attending this one on your own terms, as a successful businesswoman, a wonderful mother, and," he smiled at her reflection, "the most beautiful woman who will be there." Sarah turned to face him, gratitude and love swelling in her chest. "What did I do to deserve you?" "I ask myself the same question every day," he replied, taking her hand. "Now, let's round up those little dinosaur enthusiasts before they dismantle the entire living room." An hour later, after dropping the twins at Lucia's apartment amid much excitement and many last-minute hugs, Sarah and Cassian arrived at the Grand Hotel hosting the gala. The ballroom was transformed into a winter wonderland, with crystal decorations and white flowers creating an atmosphere of ethereal elegance. "Phoenix Publishing, Table 14, the hostess directed them after checking their names. As they made their way through the crowd, Sarah accepted congratulations on her recent promotion and the company's continued success. Under her leadership, Phoenix had expanded its reach significantly, becoming a formidable competitor in the publishing world, with a reputation for championing diverse voices and innovative storytelling. "Sarah Calloway, as I live and breathe," a familiar voice called out. Sarah turned to see Margaret Winters, the wife of one of Elian's former business associates. "You look wonderful, darling. I heard you were in Philadelphia now, doing quite well for yourself." "Thank you, Margaret. It's good to see you," Sarah replied politely, introducing Cassian as her date. "Such a shame about what happened with Elian," Margaret continued, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Though, between us, his second marriage isn't faring any better. Vivienne is leaving him, you know. The gossip is she couldn't take the pressure of producing an heir any more than you could." Sarah bristled at the casual cruelty of the remark, but maintained her composure. "I'm sorry to hear that. If you'll excuse us, we should find our table before dinner begins." As they moved away, Cassian squeezed her hand supportively. "You handled that gracefully." "Years of practice," Sarah sighed. "The New York social circle specializes in barbed comments disguised as concern." They reached their table and were soon engaged in pleasant conversation with her colleagues and their partners. The evening progressed smoothly. Excellent food, moving speeches from the hospital's beneficiaries, and the announcement of the night's fundraising total, which exceeded all expectations. As the formal part of the evening concluded and the orchestra began playing, couples drifted to the dance floor. Cassian led Sarah into a gentle waltz, and for a few blissful moments, she lost herself in the music and the security of his arms. "May I cut in?" a male voice interrupted. Sarah froze, every muscle in her body tensing at the familiar sound. Slowly she turned to face the man she had hoped never to see again. Elian Lancaster stood before her, immaculately dressed in a tuxedo that couldn't quite hide the new lines of strain around his eyes and mouth. 4 years had aged him more than they should have, though he was still handsome in the cold, perfect way that had once captivated her. "Absolutely not," Cassian replied firmly before Sarah could speak, his arm tightening protectively around her waist. Elian's eyes narrowed, taking in the protective gesture and the man who made it. "I just want a word with my ex-wife, in private." "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of Cassian," Sarah found her voice, steady and clear, despite the turbulence in her stomach. Elian's jaw tightened with familiar impatience. "Fine. Could we at least step off the dance floor? This isn't a conversation for public consumption." Sarah exchanged a glance with Cassian, who nodded his support while making it clear he wouldn't leave her side. They moved to a quiet corner of the ballroom, far enough from other guests to ensure privacy. "What are you doing in Philadelphia, Elian?" Sarah asked directly, crossing her arms. "Business," he replied vaguely. "Though I admit, seeing your name on the guest list was surprising." "I'm sure it was," she said coolly. "Now, what do you want?" Elian studied her face with an intensity that once would have made her uncomfortable. Now, she met his gaze unflinchingly. "You look well, Sarah," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Success agrees with you." "Thank you," she replied, unmoved by the attempt at charm. "But I know you didn't track me down to compliment my appearance." Elian's eyes darted to Cassian, clearly wishing for privacy. When it became evident that the other man wasn't going anywhere, he sighed. "Very well. I've been doing some thinking about our past, about the way things ended between us." "You mean when you called her useless and threw her out of your home on your anniversary?" Cassian interjected, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Elian's expression hardened. "This doesn't concern you." "It absolutely concerns me," Cassian replied firmly. "Sarah and I—" "It's all right." Sarah placed a calming hand on his arm. "I can handle this." She turned back to Elian. "Continue. You've been thinking about our past." Elian straightened his already perfect bow tie, a nervous gesture she recognized from their marriage. "I may have been harsh in my assessment of our situation. The pressure from my father, the expectations of the Lancaster name. I wasn't at my best." Sarah almost laughed at the understatement. "Harsh? You destroyed me, Elian. You made me believe I was worthless because I couldn't give you children." His eyes widened slightly. "And yet, here you are, clearly successful, clearly thriving." "No thanks to you," she replied. "I rebuilt my life from nothing after you took everything." "And I admire that resilience," he said, his tone shifting to the smooth persuasiveness he used in business negotiations. "It's one of the qualities I always appreciated about you. Your strength, your adaptability." Sarah felt her guard rising even higher. Elian never complimented without purpose. "What do you want, Elian?" "I'm not interested in a trip down memory lane." He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself. "I want to talk about reconciliation." The word hung in the air between them, so absurd that for a moment Sarah thought she had misheard. "Reconciliation," she repeated flatly. "Yes," Elian nodded, gaining confidence. "We had a good partnership, Sarah. Compatible goals, similar backgrounds." "Similar backgrounds?" she interrupted incredulously. "I was a small-town girl with student loans. You were heir to a fortune." "You know what I mean," he waved away the objection impatiently. "We worked well together socially. You were an asset at business functions, a skilled hostess. Those qualities are rare." Sarah stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Let me get this straight. You want to reconcile because I was good at throwing dinner parties." "Among other things," Elian said, his eyes following a waiter with champagne flutes. "We're both older now, wiser. We could approach things differently this time. Focus on other aspects of partnership beyond children." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. "Vivian is leaving you," Sarah stated, rather than asked. "And I'm guessing your father is putting pressure on you again about an heir." Elian's slight flinch confirmed her suspicions. "My father's expectations have always been unreasonable," he admitted. "But together, we could find solutions. Surrogacy, perhaps, or adoption." "Why now?" Sarah pressed, watching his face carefully. "After 4 years of silence, why come looking for me now?" For a moment, Elian's mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of genuine desperation. "Times change, priorities shift. Maybe I realized what I lost when I let you go." Cassian made a disbelieving sound beside her, but Sarah held up a hand, signaling him to wait. There was something more happening here, something Elian wasn't saying. "What does your father have on you, Elian?" she asked quietly. "What's he threatening you with?" The direct question caught him off guard. His composure cracked further, showing the frightened man beneath the confident facade. "He's talking about removing me as CEO, about finding another heir to the Lancaster fortune. I have 6 months to prove I'm worthy of the family name." And there it was, the real reason for his sudden appearance in her life. Not remorse, not regret, not even genuine desire for reconciliation. Just desperation to save his position and his inheritance. At that moment, across the ballroom, a commotion caught Sarah's attention. Her eyes widened as she saw Lucia hurrying through the crowd, leading Ethan and Noah by the hands. The boys were dressed in their pajamas, clearly having been hustled out of bed. "There's Mommy!" Ethan shouted, breaking free and running toward her, his brother close behind. Sarah moved instinctively to intercept them, shooting a worried glance at Lucia. "I'm so sorry," Lucia explained breathlessly as she reached them. "Noah had an asthma attack. It's under control, but he was asking for you. I tried calling but couldn't reach you." "It's okay," Sarah assured her, immediately kneeling to check Noah, who seemed fine now, but still clutched his inhaler. "Are you all right, sweetie?" Noah nodded, his solemn eyes, so like her own, meeting hers. "I got scared, Mommy, but I used my medicine like doctor. Cassian showed me." "You were very brave," Cassian said, crouching beside them and checking Noah's breathing with practiced ease. Sarah suddenly remembered Elian standing behind her. Rising slowly, she turned to face him, instinctively positioning herself between him and her sons. Elian stood frozen, his face a mask of shock as he stared at the twin boys. His eyes darted between them, taking in their dark curls and delicate features. Features that, while primarily resembling Sarah, contained just enough Lancaster characteristics to trigger questions. "Are they—" he began, his voice barely audible. "My sons," Sarah finished firmly. "Ethan and Noah." "How old are they?" Elian asked, his eyes never leaving the boys. "4," she answered, watching his mental calculations play out across his face. "But that's not— that would mean—" His voice trailed off as the implications sank in. "Are they mine?" he finally demanded, stepping closer. Sarah laughed then, a cold, sharp sound devoid of humor. "No, Elian, they're not yours. They never were, and they never will be." "But," he gestured helplessly at the timing, the coincidence. "My sons were conceived after our divorce," Sarah said clearly, wanting no misunderstanding. "Through IVF with a donor I chose specifically for his kindness, his intelligence, and his character. All qualities you lack." The truth hit Elian like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, reaching for the wall to steady himself. You had children on your own? After I left you?" "I had children on my own terms," Sarah corrected him. "Because unlike you, I wanted to be a parent for the right reasons, not for status or legacy or to please a domineering father, but out of love." Elian's shock was quickly giving way to something else, a desperate, calculating interest. "We should talk about this more privately. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow for lunch." "There's nothing to discuss," Sarah cut him off, taking each of her sons by the hand. "My children are not part of any reconciliation plan you might have. They are not your backup heirs. They are not your second chance." "Sarah, be reasonable," Elian urged, his eyes still fixed on the boys. "We could make this work. I could adopt them legally. They could have the Lancaster name, all the privileges that come with it. They would want for nothing." "They already want for nothing," Sarah replied firmly. "They have love, security, and a mother who would do anything to protect them from men like you." "You're being emotional," Elian said dismissively, reverting to his old tactics. "Think logically. Think of what I could provide for them. The best schools, connections, opportunities." "You threw me away like I was nothing," Sarah interrupted, her voice quiet but intense. "You called me useless to my face on our anniversary. You took everything I had and left me to rebuild from scratch. And now you think you can waltz back into my life and claim some connection to my children? My sons who owe their existence to your cruelty?" Elian flinched at the reminder of his own words. "I made a mistake," he admitted. "I was wrong about you. Let me make it right." "There is no making it right," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "There is no second chance. There is only this moment, where I get to walk away from you just as completely as you walked away from me 4 years ago." She lifted her chin, looking directly into the eyes that had once held such power over her. "Now you're the one left with nothing, Elian. And unlike you, I don't take pleasure in that fact. I just don't care anymore." With dignity intact and her head held high, Sarah turned away from her ex-husband. "Come on, boys, let's go home." Cassian placed a protective arm around her shoulders as Lucia gathered the twins' things. Together, they moved toward the exit, leaving Elian Lancaster alone in the crowded ballroom, surrounded by people yet completely isolated. "Mommy, who was that man?" Noah asked as they waited for the valet to bring their car. Sarah exchanged a look with Cassian before answering honestly but simply. "Someone I used to know a long time ago, before you were born." "He looked sad," Ethan observed with a child's perceptiveness. "Sometimes people are sad because of choices they made," Sarah explained gently. "But that's not for us to worry about. We have each other, and that's what matters." As they drove home along the coastal road, the twins quickly fell asleep in their car seats. Cassian reached across the console to take Sarah's hand. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She glanced at her sleeping sons in the rearview mirror, then at the man beside her who had shown her what real partnership looked like. "I'm more than okay," she answered truthfully. "For the first time since seeing him, I feel completely free." And it was true. The confrontation had exorcised the last lingering ghosts of her past. Elian Lancaster no longer had any power over her, not her self-worth, not her happiness, and certainly not her future. That future belonged solely to her sons, and to the family they were building. A family founded on love rather than obligation, on genuine care rather than legacy. Elian Lancaster sat alone in his hotel suite, a glass of scotch untouched beside him as he stared out at the Philadelphia skyline. The city lights blurred through the window, much like his thoughts, unfocused, chaotic, spinning with implications he couldn't quite grasp. Twin sons. Serafina had twin sons. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. For years he had blamed her for their childlessness, for failing to provide him with the heir his father demanded. He had discarded her like a defective appliance, certain that the problem lay with her. And now she had not one but two children, sons at that, while he remained childless after 2 marriages. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Another message from his father. He ignored it, just as he had ignored the previous 5. What could he possibly say? That he had found Serafina, only to discover she had moved on completely? That she had the children he couldn't provide, with another man who clearly adored her? That she had looked at him with such complete indifference that it had shaken him to his core? The memory of her words echoed in his mind. "Now you're the one left with nothing." She was right, of course. For all his wealth, his status, his power in the business world, Elian Lancaster had nothing of real value. No loving wife, no children, no legacy beyond material possessions that suddenly seemed meaningless. He reached for the scotch, downing it in one burning gulp before pouring another. Tomorrow he would return to New York and face his father's disappointment. Tomorrow he would watch the beginning of the end as Damian Lancaster set in motion his plan to remove his only son from his position as heir. Tomorrow his carefully constructed world would start to crumble, but tonight he allowed himself to drown in regret for perhaps the first time in his life. 1 week later, Elian sat in his father's study, the familiar surroundings of the Lancaster mansion doing nothing to ease his discomfort. Damian paced behind his massive mahogany desk, his face flushed with anger. "You mean to tell me you found her, your ex-wife, and she has twin sons and you couldn't convince her to reconcile?" Damian's voice rose with each word. "She's moved on, father," Elian replied wearily. "She has a new life, a successful career, a relationship with another man. She has no interest in returning to the Lancaster fold." "Everyone has a price," Damian snapped. "You should have offered her whatever it took, money, position, security for those boys." Elian laughed bitterly. "She doesn't need our money anymore. She's the editorial director at Phoenix Publishing, one of our major competitors in case you've forgotten. And as for security for her sons, she made it very clear they're better off without the Lancaster name." Damian stopped pacing, fixing his son with a cold stare. "You're telling me you let a solution to our problem slip through your fingers because you couldn't be bothered to try harder? Those boys could have been legally adopted, given our name, raised as proper Lancasters." "They're not merchandise, father," Elian interrupted, surprising himself with the force of his response. "They're children, her children, and she's right to keep them away from us." Damian's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Since when do you concern yourself with the moral high ground? You were perfectly happy to discard that woman when you thought she couldn't give you children." The reminder stung, especially now that Elian knew the truth. In the week since returning from Philadelphia, he had reviewed his medical records, confirming what he had tried to deny for years. The infertility had always been his issue, not Serafina's. She had suffered through treatments, blame, and ultimately rejection for a problem that had been his all along. "I was wrong," Elian admitted quietly. "About many things." Damian waved away the confession impatiently. Your personal epiphanies don't interest me. What interests me is the future of this company and this family. And right now, both are in jeopardy because of your failures. As his father continued his tirade, Elian's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out discreetly, expecting another message from his assistant about the mounting problems at the office. Instead, he saw a notification from a financial news app. Breaking: Phoenix Publishing acquires Harrison Media in landmark deal. CEO cites innovative leadership of editorial director Serafina Calloway as key to expansion strategy. Elian's blood ran cold. Harrison Media had been his target for acquisition for months, a strategic move to bolster Lancaster Industries' struggling publishing division. He had been in negotiations for weeks, confident that the deal was nearly closed, and now Serafina, his discarded wife, the woman he had called useless, had snatched it from under him. "Are you even listening to me?" Damien demanded, noticing his son's distraction. Wordlessly, Elian handed over his phone. Damien read the notification, his face darkening further. "This is what happens when you let personal matters interfere with business," he said finally, tossing the phone back. "You wasted time chasing after your ex-wife instead of securing this deal. Now she's not only rejected you personally, but beaten you professionally as well. The double humiliation was too much to bear." "I'll fix this," Elian promised desperately. "I'll find another acquisition target, something bigger, better." "No," Damien cut him off firmly. "You've had your chances, too many of them." He walked to the window, looking out over the manicured grounds of the estate. "The board meets tomorrow. I've already spoken with the key members. They agree with my assessment. It's time for new leadership at Lancaster Industries." "You can't do this," Elian protested, rising from his chair. "I'm your son, your only child." "A fact I regret more with each passing day," Damien replied coldly. "You'll retain your shares, of course, and a position on the board. But effective immediately, you are no longer CEO of Lancaster Industries. That position will be filled by Thomas Wellesley, a man who has proven his competence repeatedly, unlike my son." Wellesley, his father's most trusted advisor, a man who had been eyeing Elian's position for years. The final betrayal cut deeper than Elian could have imagined. "And what about the Lancaster legacy?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Your precious family line?" Damien's expression was implacable. "I've made arrangements. My nephew Richard's son will be named in my will as the primary inheritor of the Lancaster estate. The boy is 16, bright, ambitious. Everything you were at that age, before you disappointed me at every turn." With those words, Damien Lancaster effectively ended his son's place in the dynasty he had spent his entire life trying to preserve. The irony was almost poetic. Elian had sacrificed everything, including his marriage to Serafina, in service of a legacy that would now pass to a cousin he barely knew. He left his father's house that day stripped of his position, his purpose, and what remained of his pride. The Lancaster name, once his greatest source of strength, now felt like a hollow shell, an empty title signifying nothing but failure and regret. News of Elian Lancaster's fall from grace spread quickly through New York's business and social circles. The gossip was delicious. The heir apparent dethroned by his own father, replaced by an outsider, his personal life in shambles after a second failed marriage. Some whispered about his failure to produce an heir, others about business missteps that had cost the company millions. Few shed tears for the man who had built a reputation on cold efficiency and ruthless ambition. Sarah heard the news from Lucia, who still maintained connections in New York's publishing world. They were having coffee in Sarah's sun-drenched kitchen, the twins playing in the backyard under Cassian's watchful eye. "Apparently it's a complete ousting," Lucia reported, scrolling through an email on her phone. "Removed as CEO, removed as the primary inheritor of the Lancaster fortune, essentially demoted to just another board member with a fancy last name." Sarah watched her sons through the window, their joyful faces as they kicked a soccer ball, with Cassian bringing a smile to her lips. "I can't say I'm surprised. Damien Lancaster always valued results above all else, even his own blood." "Does it give you any satisfaction?" Lucia asked curiously. "Knowing he's finally facing consequences after what he did to you?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Not satisfaction exactly. Maybe just confirmation that the universe balances things eventually. He valued the wrong things, hurt people to get what he wanted, and ultimately lost everything that mattered. While you gained everything that truly matters, Lucia observed, nodding toward the window where Noah had climbed onto Cassian's shoulders in celebration of a goal. Yes, Sarah agreed softly, though I wouldn't have found this path if Elian hadn't forced me onto it. In a strange way, being called useless was the most useful thing that ever happened to me. It freed me to build a life on my own terms. The conversation shifted to work, the twins' upcoming school year, and Lucia's new apartment. Elian Lancaster and his downfall receded from Sarah's thoughts, becoming just another distant chapter in a story she had long since moved beyond. 3 days later, as Sarah was reviewing manuscripts in her home office, the doorbell rang. Assuming it was the package she'd been expecting, she answered without checking the peephole. Instead of a delivery person, she found herself facing a messenger holding an envelope with the Lancaster Industries logo embossed on the front. "Delivery for Serafina Calloway," the young man said, checking his clipboard. "Signature required." With a strange sense of foreboding, Sarah signed for the envelope and closed the door. For a long moment, she simply stared at the familiar insignia, wondering what possible communication Elian could have for her after their encounter at the gala. Finally, curiosity won out. She opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. Several pages of Elian's distinctive penmanship, one so familiar to her. The letter began without preamble. "Serafina, I imagine you've heard by now about my removal as CEO and the changes to my father's will. The news has spread quickly, as these things tend to do in certain circles. I find myself writing to you not to seek sympathy or reconciliation, but to offer something I should have given you years ago. The truth and an apology. The truth first. I knew about my infertility before I divorced you. I received the test results and, rather than face my own inadequacy, I chose to blame you. I called you useless when in fact it was I who failed to provide what we both wanted. It was cruel, cowardly, and unforgivable. My second marriage to Vivienne was doomed from the start for the same reason. I never told her about my condition, allowing her to believe that the failure to conceive was her burden to bear. She left me for the same reasons you should have: my dishonesty, my coldness, my obsession with maintaining the Lancaster legacy at all costs. Seeing you at the gala with your sons was perhaps the most profound shock of my life, not just because you had achieved what I could not, but because you had done so on your own terms, with dignity and purpose. You had built a family based on love rather than obligation, something I never understood the value of until it was too late. My father has disowned me in all but name. The company I dedicated my life to is now under another man's control. The fortune I was raised to inherit will largely pass to a distant cousin's son. My name, the Lancaster legacy I sacrificed everything to preserve, will continue, but without me as its standard bearer. I don't share these details to garner your pity. I share them because they have forced me to confront the emptiness of everything I valued, everything I hurt you to protect. What good is a legacy without love? What meaning does success have when achieved at the expense of basic decency? I am sorry, Serafina. Sorry for how I treated you, for the pain I caused, for the years I stole from you in pursuit of a hollow dream. I am sorry for calling you useless when you were, in fact, the most valuable person in my life. Not for what you could give me, but for who you were. I was too blind to see it then. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I recognize the full measure of my wrongs against you. And I wanted to tell you that I am genuinely happy that you found the life and family you deserve. Your sons are fortunate to have you as their mother. And the man in your life, whoever he is lucky beyond measure to have what I foolishly discarded. May you continue to flourish, free from the shadow of our past. Ellie and Sarah read the letter twice, emotions shifting from shock to anger to something like pity. This was not the Elian she had known, the cold, calculating businessman who viewed people as assets or liabilities. This was a broken man confronting the consequences of his choices, perhaps for the first time in his life. She folded the letter carefully and crossed to the fireplace that dominated one wall of the living room. The summer evening was cool enough to justify a small fire, which crackled invitingly in the grate. For a moment, she held the letter over the flames, watching them reach for the paper. Then, with a deliberate motion, she dropped it into the fire, watching as Elian's words, his confession, his regret, his belated apology, curled and blackened, and finally disappeared into ash. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need his acknowledgement of her worth. She had found that worth herself, built it from the ground up after he had stripped away everything she thought defined her. "Mommy, come see what we made," Ethan's voice called from the beach that stretched behind their house. Sarah smiled, moving away from the fire and toward the sliding glass doors that led to the sand. The twins were putting the finishing touches on an elaborate sand castle, their small hands patting and shaping with serious concentration. Cassian knelt beside them, helping Noah place a shell as a flag on the highest tower. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, joining them on the sand. "A perfect castle. Doctor, Cassian says we can live in it," Noah informed her solemnly. "Well, it might get a bit wet when the tide comes in," Sarah laughed, catching Cassian's eye with a smile. "I told them we'd build a new one tomorrow," he explained, rising to stand beside her. "Even better than this one." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of the pink and gold, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. Here, with the sound of the waves, the laughter of her sons, and the steady presence of the man who loved her for exactly who she was, she had found something Ellie and Lancaster never would. A home built on genuine connection rather than obligation, joy rather than status, love rather than legacy. She no longer needed closure from Elian. She had built her own ending to that chapter of her life, an ending that had become the beginning of something far more beautiful than she could have imagined in her darkest moments 4 years ago. As Cassian wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close to his side, and the twins chased each other along the edge of the waves, Sarah closed her eyes briefly, savoring the moment. This was her legacy, not a name or a fortune or a business empire, but this family, this love, this life she had created on her own terms. And it was more than enough. It was everything. "What are you thinking about?" Cassian asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Sarah smiled, leaning into his embrace as they watched their sons. For that was how she had come to think of them, their sons, racing back toward them, faces alight with joy and mischief. "I was thinking that sometimes the worst endings lead to the best beginnings," she replied. "And that being called useless was the most useful thing that ever happened to me." Cassian kissed her temple gently. "The man was a fool." "Yes," Sarah agreed simply. "But I'm grateful for the path it set me on." As the family made their way back to the house, the twins running ahead with boundless energy, Sarah didn't spare another thought for the letter now reduced to ashes in her fireplace, or for the man who had written it. Elian Lancaster was truly and completely part of her past, a chapter closed, a lesson learned, a detour that had ultimately led her home. She had won, not by defeating him or by proving him wrong, but by finding happiness that had nothing to do with him at all. And that was the most complete victory of all. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this story of triumph over adversity. Comment below where you're watching from. We love to hear from our audience around the world.